How's it going, everyone? Austin Honecker here. I just want to come on here for a while, and no, it's not a wrestling review or me singing a song or talking about life and everything. This is my Dark Side of the Ring Season 3 review. Just know this season, Dark Side of the Ring Season 3 had 14 episodes. Now, here's my review. For episode 1, it was called Pillman Part 1. That was about the late great Brian Pillman. That was talking about how he grew up and how he had to have over 100 surgeries and everything, and talked about his start in football playing for the Cincinnati Bengals and then going to the Calgary Stampeders and suffering an ankle injury that ended his football career, and then talked about his rise to professional wrestling when he went to train for the late great Stu Hart and got his start in Stampede Wrestling, and then went on to WCW, and then went on to, well, with WCW he got fired, but then he went on to ECW for a publicity stint, and then left because he was a free agent after he got fired from WCW and went to ECW. But he was only in ECW for a short period of time, and then went to WWE, and he was in WWE for a while, and then it also talked about his love affairs and how he was how he was a ladies' man, and how he couldn't stay faithful to how he couldn't stay faithful to one woman, and talked about how he had 3 kids by 3 different women, had Danny by an ex-girlfriend he was with, can't remember her name, had Brittany by his ex-wife Rochelle, and then had Brian Pillman Jr. He had Brian Jr. by his wife Melanie. That's what that episode talked about. And the people that were interviewed for this episode were Stone Cold Steve Austin, Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, Brian Pillman Jr., son of the late great Brian Pillman, Linda Pillman, sister of the late great Brian Pillman, Kim Wood, Cincinnati Bengals coach, Dave Meltzer, Brittany Pillman, daughter of the late great Brian Pillman, Danny Pillman, daughter of the late great Brian Pillman, Eric Bischoff, and Melanie Pillman, widow of the late great Brian Pillman. Episode 2 was Pillman Part 2. That was about the late great Brian Pillman. It talked about how he suffered in a really bad, he went through a bad car wreck and totaled his Jeep and everything, and talked about how he couldn't stay home or anything because he wanted to be in the ring and everything, and then talked about his drug use and everything because of trying to self-medicate himself and everything, and then it talked about his downward spiral in the wrestling business and everything, and then it also touched on his death from when he died in the hospital in Minnesota, not the hospital, died in his hotel room in Minnesota due to heart disease, and how WWE was notified about it and everything. That's what Pillman Part 2 was about. The people that were interviewed for Pillman Part 2 were Linda Pillman, sister of the late great Brian Pillman, Melanie Pillman, widow of the late great Brian Pillman, Kim Wood, Cincinnati Bengals coach, Brittany Pillman, daughter of the late great Brian Pillman, Brian Pillman Jr., son of the late great Brian Pillman, Danny Pillman, daughter of the late great Brian Pillman, Jim Cornette, Dave Meltzer, Jim Ross, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Eric Bischoff. Okay. Episode 3 was The Ultra Violence of Nick Gage. Now this episode was about this episode was about deathmatch wrestler Nick Gage. This episode talked about how Nick Gage grew up, how Nick Gage got his start. This episode talked about how Nick Gage got his start in the wrestling business and how he grew up, and it talked about how he grew up as a professional wrestling fan and got into deathmatch wrestling and everything, and talked about his career in professional wrestling and how he almost died in the ring. How he did die from going into a light tube in his death match against Thumbtack Jack, and ended up miraculously getting brought back to life and everything, and talked about how him and his brother Justice Payne got into the business and everything, and it also talked about how Nick Gage's mom passed away and how it really affected Nick Gage and his girlfriend Sandra and everything, and talked about how they both went through a deep depression over losing his mother, and how they they went homeless and were trying to live everywhere and everything, and were to no avail and everything. And it talked about how Nick Gage robbed a bank for money, and how he went and blurted to Brett Lauderdale, the owner of Game Changer Wrestling, and people and everything, and then Nick Gage ended up turning himself in to prison, and talked about how he done his time in prison, then went back to professional wrestling, then tried to steal somebody else's urine for a drug test, but got caught, and then ended up going back to prison, done some more time in prison, and then it also talked about his death match against David Arquette and everything. It also talked about his brother Justice Payne's death from suicide and how it affected him and everything. And so that was what that episode was about. And the people that were interviewed for it were Nick Gage, John Moxley, Brett Lauderdale, Game Changer Wrestling owner, Sandra, girlfriend of Nick Gage, and David Arquette. Episode 4 was Collision in Korea. Now this episode talked about the joint pay-per-view event between World Championship Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling back in 1995, and it talked about how WCW and New Japan had a great partnership, and how that they exchanged talent and everything, and then discussed a joint pay-per-view event and everything, and talked about doing it in Korea and everything. And then the WCW talent went over to Korea, and so did the New Japan talent and everything. And the WCW talent were were looked at as evil people because the Koreans didn't like the Americans and everything, and they kept their eyes on them and everything, and then talked about how the Korean crowd was not into the show, how they didn't react to it or anything because they didn't know anything about professional wrestling until the match between the Nature Boy Ric Flair and Antonio Inoki and everything, because they knew about Antonio Inoki because they faced their Korean wrestler in Juka or whatever his name is. And it talked about how the WCW talent wasn't happy to be in Korea and how they were looking forward to leaving after the two-night pay-per-view event, and how it drew over 1,000 plus people, and talked about how the WCW talent, when they got back from Korea, they were really happy and everything, and pretty much that was what that episode was about. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Eric Bischoff, Scott Norton, Too Cold Scorpio, Antonio Inoki, Mike Chinoy, CNN correspondent, and Sonny Ono. Episode 5 was Becoming Warrior. This episode was about the late great Ultimate Warrior, talking about how the late great Ultimate Warrior was a bodybuilder and how he was going to school to be a chiropractor, and talked about how he got his start in professional wrestling, teaming up with Sting and everything, and it talked about his marriage with his ex-wife Sherry Tyree and everything, and it talked about their marriage, and then talked about how they were struggling in the end because the late great Ultimate Warrior cheated on his ex-wife with another woman, and talked about how nobody in the nobody in the wrestling locker room liked him and everything because they thought he was too dangerous to work with and everything. And then it talked about Ultimate Warrior's final appearances in WWE when he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and how he made amends with everybody and went and done his WWE Hall of Fame speech. And then 2 nights later was on WWE Monday Night Raw and cut a promo and everything. And then the day after that promo, it talked about how the day after that promo, he took a heart attack and passed away. And passed away. That was back in 2014 when he passed away. That was pretty, and so that's what that episode was about. The people that were interviewed for it were Sherry Tyree, ex-wife of the late great Ultimate Warrior, Jim Cornette, Jim Ross, David Manning, Eric Bischoff, and Jake the Snake Roberts. Episode 6 was In the Shadow of Grizzly Smith. Now, this episode was about the late great Grizzly Smith, Jake the Snake Roberts, Sam Houston, and Rockin' Robin. Now, this episode was talking about how Grizzly Smith got his start, how the late great Grizzly Smith got his start in the wrestling business, and how he had several kids by different women and everything, and talked about how he was a child molester and everything, and it talked about how Jake the Snake Roberts, Sam Houston, and Rockin' Robin got their start in the wrestling business, and it also talked about how Jake the Snake Roberts, Sam Houston, and Rockin' Robin all had rough childhoods and everything, and how they went into drugs and alcohol and everything, and it talked about how Grizzly Smith had 2 other kids, Richard Neighbors and Jocelyn Smith, or whatever her name is. It talked about how Jocelyn was kidnapped, and everything, and talked about how it also talked about how Grizzly Smith ended up passing away from Alzheimer's in 2010, and it also talked about how Jake the Snake Roberts, Sam Houston, Rockin' Robin, and Richard Neighbors were all still estranged to this day. That's what that episode was about. And the people that were interviewed for it were Jake the Snake Roberts, Rockin' Robin, Jim Cornette, Sam Houston, Richard Neighbors, Baby Doll, and Carl Buzz Gage, the police officer. Okay. Episode 7 was The Dynamite Kid. This episode was about the late great Dynamite Kid. It talked about how the late great Dynamite Kid got his start in professional wrestling, and how he met his wife, and they had 2 kids named Bronwyn and Merrick, and how he was a good father to them and everything. And it talked about how he was going downhill in the wrestling business and everything, and talked about how he was abusive to his wife and everything, and it talked about how he abused his wife and tried to kill her and pulled her hair while she was pregnant with his daughter Amaris, and how the Dynamite Kid himself left Canada and went back to England and ended up paralyzed in a wheelchair and everything. And Dynamite Kid talked about, it also talked about how Dynamite Kid wanted to be with these children again but never showed up. And then it talked about how Amaris was found out about the late great Chris Benoit and his wife and son, and how Michelle, their mother, told Amaris about what happened, because Amaris never got to see her father, the late great Dynamite Kid. And it talked about how Amaris was pissed off at not only the late great Dynamite Kid for what he done to her mother, but was also pissed off at her mother for not telling her the story sooner. And it also touched on Bronwyn going to visit the Dynamite Kid, the late great Dynamite Kid, but Amaris wouldn't go, and it covered the visit between the late great Dynamite Kid and his daughter Bronwyn and everything. And it also talked about how the late great Dynamite Kid passed away back in 2018 due to health issues and everything. Due to health issues. That's what that episode was about. And the people that were interviewed for it were Lance Storm, Michelle Billington, ex-wife of the late great Dynamite Kid, Julie Hart, ex-wife of Bret the Hitman Hart, Bronwyn Billington, daughter of the late great Dynamite Kid, Amaris Billington, daughter of the late great Dynamite Kid, Mick Foley, Dave Meltzer, Dan Spivey, Gary Ports, and Jacques Ragu. Okay, episode 8 was The Plane Ride from Hell. Now this episode was about WWE taking a tour in the United Kingdom, in South America, and talked about the plane ride to there and the plane ride back from there, and it talked about how the Nature Boy Ric Flair was the most talkative one on the plane and everything, and it talked about how Jim Ross was the head of talent relations and was in charge of the whole thing, and it talked about how Michael P.S. Hayes came up and slapped JBL in the face. it talked about how Michael P.S. Hayes came up to JBL and punched him in the face, and then JBL slapped Michael Hayes in the face and knocked him out, and then X-Pac ended up cutting Michael P.S. Hayes' ponytail off, and it talked about how the late great Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig was a prankster and put shaving cream on Brock Lesnar's head and smacked his head, and then Brock Lesnar came after Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, and they started beating the shit out of each other. And it talked about how Goldust, aka the natural Dustin Rhodes, was singing to his ex-wife Terry Runnels and everything, and how Jim Ross got Dustin Rhodes to stop singing and go to bed and everything, and then talked about how Dustin Rhodes spit snuff in the hood of the seat of the plane and everything, and it talked about how the Nature Boy Ric Flair was flirtatious and had Heidi Doyle and the other flight attendant grab his nuts while he was in his robe, naked in his robe and everything, and talked about how the flight attendants were terrified and everything, and talked about how Scott Hall licked while Heidi Doyle, the flight attendant, was trying to tend to Scott Hall while he was asleep, but Scott Hall ended up Scott Hall was high as a kite and licked Heidi Doyle and everything, and that made her uncomfortable and everything, and so Justin Credible ended up getting Scott Hall in a wheelchair and wheeling him off the plane and everything, and then it talked about how Vince McMahon was pissed off it talked about how Vince McMahon scalded Jim Ross for what happened, and because this was to and from the Insurrection pay-per-view that WWE done in 2002. But after the whole thing happened, it talked about how Vince McMahon fired both Scott Hall and the late great Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig and everything, and it talked about how the Nature Boy Ric Flair and Goldust were reprimanded, pretty much given verbal warnings and everything. Well, pretty much given verbal warnings. Now that's what that episode was about. And the people that were interviewed for it were Justin Credible, Mike Chioda, Tommy Dreamer, Jim Ross, Heidi Doyle, the flight attendant, Terry Runnels, Rob Van Dam, X-Pac, and Scott Hall. That was episode 8. Episode 9 was The Double Life of Chris Kanyon. Now, this episode was about the late great Chris Kanyon. This episode talked about how Chris Kanyon grew up in a bad childhood, and it also talked about how he was trying to hide his sexuality and everything, and it talked about how he got his start in the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about his mental health issues and everything, and then it also talked about how he passed away from suicide in 2010 from a drug overdose and everything, but it touched on his life in WCW, WWE, and in the Indies and everything as well. That's what that episode was about. Now, the people that were interviewed for it were Diamond Dallas Page, the Young Bucks, Matt and Nick Jackson, Raphael Morphy, Pro Wrestling Executive, James Mitchell, Chris Jericho, Brian Cage, and Luke Hawks. That was episode 9. Now, episode 10 was episode 10 was Blood and Wire Onita's FMW. Now, this episode was about Atsushionito's promotion, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling. It talked about how Atsushionito got his start in the wrestling business and how he was trying to compete with Antonio Inuki's New Japan Pro Wrestling and Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling, and talked about how Atsushionito started Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, FMW, and how he wanted to make it different than any other wrestling promotion, and how he made it death matches and everything. And then it talked about how the late great Hayabusa got his start in the wrestling business, and talked about how Atsushionito retired and ended up giving FMW to his ring announcer, Shoichi Arai. And it talked about how Hayabusa the late great Hayabusa ended his career and by botching a Asai moonsault off the ropes, and ended up landing on his head and broke his neck and ended up paralyzed and everything. And it talked about how Shoichi Arai, the late Shoichi Arai, ended up in debt and ended up in a depression. It talked about how Shoichi Arai Shoichi Arai, as soon as he took over FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, he was distancing away from the death matches and wanted to make it a sports entertainment feel to it and everything. And talked about how the late Shoichi Arai ended up in debt and ended up depressed from it and everything. And it talked about how the late Shoichi Arai committed suicide from being in debt and everything. And it talked about how Hayabusa died, the late great Hayabusa passing away in 2016 and everything. And it also talked about how Atsushionito was no longer welcome in his own promotion, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, when he retired and everything. Now, that's what that episode was about. Now, the people that were interviewed for it were Atsushionito, Terry Funk, Chris Jericho, Mick Foley, Ricky Fuji, Sabu, Ayan Izaki, daughter of the late great Hayabusa, and Shell, daughter of the late Shoichi Arai. That was episode 10. Episode 11, episode 11 was Bikers, Bombs, and Bedlam, the Johnny Canine story. Now, this episode was about the late great Johnny Canine, talking about how he got his start in the wrestling business and how he was a jobber in WWE and how he got started in Smoky Mountain Wrestling under Bruiser Bedlam instead of Johnny Canine and everything. And it talked about how he met his wife Tracy Edwards, because she was a stripper at a strip club, and that's how he met her, and they fell in love and got married. And it talked about how Johnny Canine ended up getting released from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and wrestling for the Indies and everything, and it talked about how the late great Johnny Canine ended up working for a biker gang called Satan's Choice and everything, and it talked about how Johnny Canine and his wife Tracy Edwards were having trouble in their marriage, and it talked about how the late great Johnny Canine went into an acting career but didn't make it, and talked about going into a union gang. And it talked about him going into a union gang, and also talked about how he was arrested a few times, and it talked about how the late great Johnny Canine passed away in 2017, something like that, due to either a drug overdose or natural causes or something like that. That's what that episode was about. The people that were interviewed for it were Scott D'Amore, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Tracy Edwards, widow of the late great Johnny Canine, Jim Cornette, Bill Dunphy, journalist, Lynn Eisner, detective, and Mark Carlos, member of Satan's Choice. Episode 12 was The Many Faces of Luna Vashon. Now, this episode was about the late great Luna Vashon. This episode talked about how Luna Vashon got her start in professional wrestling, and how she was trained by the late great Fabulous Moolah, and how the Fabulous Moolah made the late great Luna Vashon meet up with a guy to take pictures of her, and how that guy tried to rape her and she fought him off and everything. And it talked about how she was married to Dick Slater but got divorced, and then was married to Tom Nash but got divorced, then was married to Gangrel and got divorced. And it talked about how she had a son named Van Herd and everything, and it talked about how it talked about her time in WWE and her time in ECW and everything, and it talked about her time in the Indies and everything as well, and it talked about how she was struggling with mental health, and how she was on drugs, and how she was a tow truck operator before she passed away and everything. And it talked about how she passed away from a drug overdose in 2010 and everything. That's what that was about. The people that were interviewed for this episode were Van Herd, son of the late great Luna Vashon, Gangrel, Mick Foley, Paul the Butcher Vashon, Mad Maxine, Kim Sachs, and Medusa. Episode 13 was Extreme and Obscene, Rob Black's XPW. Now, this episode was talking about how Rob Black was in the porn industry, and talking about how he was a wrestling fan and how he wanted to mix professional wrestling and porn together, and started a promotion called Extreme Pro Wrestling, and talking about how he wanted to partner up with wanted to partner up with Paul Heyman's ECW, and talking about how they were partnered up, but Paul Heyman screwed him over by ECW getting a deal and everything, and Rob Black was doing everything he can to get revenge on Paul Heyman. And then it talked about how ECW went under, and Rob Black ended up stealing ECW talent and everything, and it talked about how a lot of the talent didn't like working for Rob Black and everything, and it talked about how Rob Black ended up getting arrested for challenging the government because of his porn and everything. And then it talked about but that's pretty much what that episode was about. Rob Black trying to mix porn and wanting to mix professional wrestling and porn together and everything. Now the people that were interviewed for it were Jessica Darlin, New Jack, David Marquez, Joey Munoz, Sylvia Munoz, Mike Hartsfield, William Welch, Luke Hawks, and Sabu. And episode 14 was the Steroid Trials. This episode was about Vince McMahon versus the United States of America. A lawsuit between Vince McMahon and the United States of America. Now, this episode was talking about how Vince McMahon encouraged his WWE talent to take steroids, and how that fraud doctor George Harlan ended up prescribing steroids to the wrestlers and everything. And it talked about how George Harlan was arrested and everything. And it talked about how Vince McMahon wanted Hulk Hogan to reveal the truth about steroids, and Hulk Hogan wouldn't do it and everything. And it talked about how Vince McMahon ended up with a lawsuit about steroids and everything. And it talked about how Jerry McDevitt represented WWE, and Laura McDerry, or whatever her name is, represented Vince McMahon. And it talked about how Hulk Hogan how Vince McMahon didn't want Hulk Hogan in WWE anymore, and how he wanted to move on and everything. And then it talked about how Hulk Hogan appeared in the courtroom during the steroid trials, and it talked about how Hulk Hogan wouldn't come clean or anything. It talked about how George Harlan ended up coming to the court and everything, and telling his side and everything. And it also talked about how Vince McMahon won the lawsuit from the United States of America, and how he didn't go to prison and everything. And how it talked about how Vince McMahon, Linda McMahon, and everybody in WWE, well, Vince McMahon and Linda McMahon celebrated Vince McMahon not going to court and everything. That was what this episode was about. And the people that were interviewed for it were Jerry McDevitt, WWE lawyer, Jim Ross, Wade Keller, Dave Meltzer, John Arezzi, Warlord, B. Brian Blair, and Phil Mushnick, sports columnist. Dark Side of the Ring Season 3 was awesome from start to finish. Just like Season 1 was awesome, Season 2 was awesome, and Season 3, it was the same as Season 1, Season 2. It was awesome. Now, Season 4 of Dark Side of the Ring is currently airing, so I'm going to wait until Dark Side of the Ring Season 4 is done airing off TV. Then I'll watch all the episodes, because there's 10 episodes for Season 4. So for episodes 1 through 10, I'll watch them. Then I'll do my review just like I have for Season 1, Season 2, and Season 3. Now, one thing I did forget to add, everyone, in my Dark Side of the Ring reviews, for Season 1, Dutch Mantell narrated episodes 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, and Mick Foley narrated episode 3. For season 2, Chris Jericho narrated all 10 episodes, and for season 3, Chris Jericho narrated all 14 episodes. Now, like I said, everyone, Dark Side of the... But anyway, with that being said, everyone, I just wanted to come on here for a while and give my review for Dark Side of the Ring Season 3. Like I said, it was awesome from start to finish. I really enjoyed it. And with that being said, my name is Austin Honecker, and I will catch your fucking ass down the goddamn road. Peace. Out.